You are live and recording. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to call our October meeting of the Delta Independent Science Board to order. For the astute observers out there will recognize that I'm not Lisa Wanger and that our chair is currently overseas and sends her apologies for missing this meeting. We'd like to first invite people to provide public comments. You can provide an oral comment if you're on Zoom by raising your hand, or send us an email at disb@deltacouncil.ca.gov. And when you're recognized to provide your 3-minute public comment, please state your name and affiliation before you do that. I'd like to do a roll call, and so when I call your name, just tell us your full name and whether or not you have any new declarations to make. And if you're not speaking, I would remind folks to mute their microphone. Steve Brandt, no new declarations. Jay?
Jay Lund, no new declarations for the last time.
Tom?
Tom Holzer, no new declarations for another time.
Tanya?
Tanya Heikela, no new declarations.
Joe?
Joe Fernando, no new declarations for the last time.
And Virginia?
Virginia Dale, no new declarations.
We have Diane McKnight and Obey will be joining us, but they will be late when they join. And Bob Nyman has sent his apologies, so he won't be available today. Today's meeting is, the agenda is kind of short because, as you're all aware, most of us are spending our Delta time still reviewing the EIR, so we've shortened the number of agenda items on today's meeting. Mostly we'll be talking about the status of our review of the EIR and look at some bigger questions, just to have a little bit of a discussion on those questions. And we'll also get a science report on mitigation that we've asked our postdocs to put together, information item. So I guess I'll move right into the item number 2 on the agenda, which is the chair's report. And as you might have guessed, this is the last public meeting for Joe Fernando and Jay Lund before they transition off the board. Joe will officially leave on October 14th, and Jay's final day is October 31st. We will have a separate item to later in the day to get their reflections on their service of the board and allow other board members an opportunity to welcome or give them best wishes. On November 1st, Dr. Inga Werner and Anna Michalek will start their term. We've been in discussions with them, and hopefully they'll attend our in-person meeting on the 3rd and 4th of November. Now, we're not going to have a Delta Science Lead report or a Council Chair report for this meeting. We're thinking of moving those kind of reports and having them be every second meeting rather than every meeting, and to allow more time and in-depth discussion during those presentations and reports. A copy of the Delta Lead Scientist report is actually part of your package, along with a legislative update and outreach report. I'm going to turn it over for Jay, who's going to report on a technical workshop he's involved in. Jay?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. So the water supply reliability report that we finished some months ago. There's some interest in that, and the California Water and Environment Modeling Forum, which is sort of a professional group of geeks that do modeling for California water and environment, is sponsoring a workshop on Thursday, October 27th in the morning. And in that workshop, it's going to have 2 reports being discussed. And I think that the pairing is really very good. There's the water supply reliability report that we did on water supply reliability estimation, and then a report that QEMF has recently completed on modeling protocols. So what are some sort of professional practices and approaches for improving and standardizing a little bit the and raising expectations for modeling techniques and have more systematic and better documented models. So I think it's very good to see progress on both these fronts by both these organizations, and to have a joint workshop Thursday morning on the October 27th.
Jay, is that going to be available for attending by Zoom?
Yes, there is a Zoom address, and I think Edmund has sent this out to everybody.
Okay, and also will there be, you know, whether or not it's going to be recorded so people can look at it afterwards?
I would hope so, but I don't know that for sure.
Okay, maybe
I
Jake,
think it's a
or
good idea to do that.
yeah, maybe Edmund can check that out, and if it is, send it out to the board members so they can, if they can't make it on that particular day, they have an opportunity to look at it later. Now, did you say it was on the 28th?
The 27th, Thursday, the 27th.
Okay. Final thing on my report is, as part of your meeting package, we also received an additional 2 letters from various individuals, but two letters on the stating that the Delta Conveyance Project is not a solution to drought and climate change, and that brings the total to 984 letters on this topic. So I think that's it for my report. Any questions or comments from board members? Okay, and any public comments on this item, Edmund?
There are none.
Okay, let's move on to item 3, which is entitled "A Overview of Mitigation." Mitigation has been, from a historical perspective, of course, the board has reviewed, done a separate review on restoration, and early on in the development of the board, and also as part of our various reviews, including reviews of the BDCP and elsewhere, we've talked about restoration. We've also had to deal with mitigation, and so we've asked our two postdocs, Kristine and Lillian, to do a sort of a literature review and give us sort of a scientific perspective on mitigation in terms of what it is and what it means, and just give us some background. We view this as a information item, so we'll ask them to give a presentation and open up to board members on question. So Kristine and Lillian, who's starting?
I'm starting. So I can, thanks, Steve. I'll go ahead and share my screen. 1 second. Okay, let me know if you can see that. I'm seeing thumbs up. Okay. So thank you so much, Steve, for the introduction. We'll be talking today about some of what we found from the literature regarding wetland mitigation in general. So this will be a pretty general overview, and then we're happy to go into details during the Q&A portion. So I'll be starting out with just discussing some of the key concepts, things that we found coming up in the literature quite often, such as, functional equivalency or no net loss. And then Lillian will go into more details about the various stages of mitigation and some of the challenges. And then we'll end on a discussion of some of the recommendations, some of the knowledge gaps that are popping up quite frequently as we're doing this literature review. So for our overview, I wanted to start with just wetlands and the relationship between wetlands and the Clean Water Act, since for both Lillian and I, this is our first time kind of looking at this. We wanted to start with just a very basic overview of how those two are connected. And effectively, Section 404 of the Clean Water Act is what protects wetlands. Wetlands are recognized as part of the nation's waters, and this is due to the many functions that wetlands provide that are directly related to the objectives of the Clean Water Act. So things like the improvement of water quality, maintaining a natural flood control, stabilization of shorelines, things like that. So these are not the only functions that wetlands provide, of course, but for the Clean Water Act in particular, these are the ones that are most important. And so Section 404 is what empowers the US Army Corps of Engineers and the EPA to set mitigation requirements when wetlands are impacted. So in general, when permittees who want to impact wetlands or for project development or things like that, there's a general hierarchy. So they are asked to first avoid impacts, minimize impacts, and if they are unable to fully negate any impacts, then they are required to officially mitigate. And so the Corps and the EPA are able to set requirements for how that mitigation occurs. So one of the foundational concepts in mitigation is this concept of no net loss, which is the idea that when wetlands are impacted, any of the mitigation that occurs should ideally restore both the acres that are lost due to impacts as well as the functions. So there are many types of mitigation activities: restoration, creation, enhancement, and preservation. But for all of those activities and for all of the mitigation that occurs under Section 404, that concept of no net loss is the bar. Those projects should meet that requirement. So these different activities have differences in terms of how often they meet that requirement of no net loss. So for example, restoration tends to be among the more reliable ways of making sure that wetland acres are restored and that any losses of function are restored back to where they were. In contrast, preservation doesn't necessarily mean an increase of acres and doesn't necessarily mean a replacement of function. This doesn't mean that preservation is bad or that all mitigation projects should always be restoration or creation. It just means that there are trade-offs among these different ways of mitigating for project impacts, and that's something that needs to be considered when permittees are thinking about what types of mitigation might be appropriate. And so one of the things that we'll be discussing a little bit later is that while mitigating for area tends to be a little straightforward, right? If you are going to develop 50 acres of wetland, you need to restore 50 acres of wetland. Function is a little bit more difficult. So measuring and defining whether or not a mitigation site is functionally equivalent to what is lost is much more challenging. So among these different ways that mitigation can happen, there are generally three main categories: permittee responsible mitigation, in lieu fee programs, and mitigation banks. So there are nuances within all of these different categories, but this is generally the broad ways that people tend to comply with their mitigation requirements under Section 404. So the diagram or the graph on your right is displaying kind of the proportion of ways that projects have met their mitigation requirements over time. So it used to be that permittee responsible mitigation was the most dominant, and then mitigation banking has kind of taken over a little bit in terms of becoming more important to meeting compliance requirements. And so we'll go into that a little bit later. But I wanted to start with permittee responsible mitigation because this tends to be the more dominant way that mitigation requirements are met. And effectively, this means that whoever the permit is given to needs to complete the mitigation and calculate out how much to compensate for the impacts. So they are legally responsible for making sure that their mitigation site meets the performance standards all the way up until the mitigation site is certified. Once it is certified, the permittee is officially no longer responsible for maintaining or managing that site. So this is a form of single party mitigation where the permittee and the person performing the mitigation are the exact same entity. With in lieu fees, we're getting into third-party mitigation mechanisms where the permittee pays or donates or funds a different entity to do the mitigation. So the example I have here is the California State Coastal Conservancy. So a permittee can pay the SCC to do a mitigation project on their behalf. So SCC can say, it'll take us X amount of dollars to restore 50 acres at Caleguas Creek. And when the permittee pays that amount over time, then the permittee is considered compliant with their permit requirements. Similarly, for mitigation banks, the permittee can pay a certain number of funds for credits that translates to a physical site where wetland mitigation has occurred. So as I mentioned earlier, mitigation banks have increased their dominance in terms of the amount of permits that use this mechanism as a way of meeting compliance. And this is directly related to the fact that unlike in lieu fees or permittee responsible mechanisms of mitigation, mitigation banks have actually already completed the wetland mitigation and are now selling the credits to permittees to meet their objectives. So the physical act of actually restoring, enhancing, or creating a site is already completed, and the Corps has actually signed off that this site meets these certain performance requirements, and therefore you can now sell these credits to permittees that are looking to meet their compliance objectives. So that's why mitigation banks tend to be the more preferred way of meeting compliance for mitigation permits under Section 404. So in general, because of these mitigation requirements that have been put in place, there has been a general trend of decreasing loss of wetlands due to development, because it does make destroying wetlands a little bit more difficult when you have to think about, well, how am I going to replace all of those impacts? And then so throughout the different studies that we've looked at, there's been a general trend that different wetlands are easier or harder to mitigate for. So freshwater emergent wetlands tend to be easier to restore or create as opposed to other wetland types like vernal pools, which have very specific requirements. And then in terms of the different ways that mitigation can occur, restoration tends to be among the more reliable. This has to do with the fact that it's very difficult to create a wetland from scratch. So restoring a wetland where the topography is already in place, the hydrological conditions might already be established, is a lot easier than trying to create a hard pan layer for a vernal pool. And then in terms of different mitigation mechanisms, wetland banking tends to have a higher gain-loss ratio in terms of no net loss. So that diagram on your right is just kind of a Sankey diagram of how these different mitigation methods work out. So I'm going to hand things over to Lillian now to talk about the different stages of mitigation, but I just wanted to keep things in mind that all of these apply to in lieu fees, mitigation banks, and permittee responsible, even if we're not necessarily calling those out specifically. Lillian, feel free to let me know when you're unmuted and I'll flip the slides accordingly.
All set. All right. Thanks, Kristine. So as Kristine mentioned, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the specific components of a mitigation plan. And I'm not going to go through these step by step, but instead I'll cover some key points, such as the conceptual and site design of mitigation, the monitoring, and then the certification. So next slide, please. Great. Okay, so as Kristine mentioned, and as was explained previously, the whole objective of mitigation is to replace this ecosystem function lost as a result of the activity that's actually being mitigated for. And so the success of this is often represented as a mitigation ratio, which compares the area restored to the area lost for a given habitat. So generally, federal requirements say that there needs to be a minimum of this 1-to-1 ratio is required. So, so as Kristine said, if you are impacting 50 acres of wetland, you need to then restore at least a minimum of 50 acres. So this figure on the right shows the area of wetland impacts that were permitted, shown in open circles, the mitigation required for the permit itself, shown in open squares, and then the anticipated gain of wetland habitat. Oh, I'm sorry, the mitigation required is shown in dark circles, and the anticipated gain of wetland habitat from the permitted mitigation is shown in open squares. So what you can notice from this figure, while the specifics are not super important, is that generally there's a lot more mitigation required than the anticipated gain of wetlands. So this is a strategy where increasing the ratio above 1:1 can reduce some of the uncertainty of success in mitigation. And also it can account for the method of mitigation, such as preservation, which doesn't necessarily create additional acres of habitat, or the difficulty of restoring certain functions that the mitigation is designed to account for. Next slide, please. Great. Okay, so generally right now, mitigation is supposed to take a watershed approach because it considers both landscape characteristics and also existing watershed plans where they exist. And so these landscape characteristics that might be considered are hydrological conditions or soil characteristics, watershed scale features such as aquatic habitat diversity or habitat connectivity, the size and location of the mitigation site relative to the hydrologic sources, as well as the compatibility with adjacent land uses such as agriculture. So a watershed approach also has to consider, or also is designed to consider reasonably foreseeable ecological or social effects for the mitigation itself. And so this could be anywhere from effects on ecologically important species, cultural sites, or effects on local or regional restoration or water quality goals. And importantly, compensation sites should be adjacent to existing aquatic resources to try to maintain some of that ecological connectivity. Okay, next slide, please. So once you have started constructing the mitigation site and once the mitigation is starting to go through, generally, performance standards are used to determine whether the project is actually on track to meet the goals and functions that the mitigation was designed for. And performance standards are generally ecologically based, and they may include measures of vegetation, hydrology, total acreage, or quantitative analyses of other desired functions. In specific here, we're referring to wetland functions. These generally have to be based on a best available science, as well as they may be revised in accordance with the adaptive management plan that was set up for the mitigation. And so performance standards could, for example, could be 80% of vegetation cover for a given area, or a certain increase in population size for a fish or a bird. And once these performance standards are met, that's when the mitigation switches to this long-term management and monitoring of this site. Next slide, please. So monitoring is one of the most important parts of the mitigation process because it's used to determine whether the mitigation site is actually meeting its performance standards. And so as such, it's an essential part of this adaptive management plan for the mitigation because it can provide a very early indication of any potential problems that the site might have, such as some ecosystem functions not necessarily being restored, or animals that you're specifically focused on may not be returning to the site because conditions aren't suitable. So you can get kind of an early indication of any issues through this whole adaptive management and monitoring feedback loop. So monitoring is generally required for about 5 years after a mitigation project is constructed. So what happens with the monitoring is that the mitigated site gets compared to, or certain conditions within the mitigated site get compared to conditions within a reference site. And so this reference site needs to be chosen appropriately because it should have the same hydrological conditions, the same biological characteristics, and generally provide the same functions that the mitigated site is hoping to achieve. So once these comparisons start happening, generally we wait, or usually it's weighted so that the mitigation site is designed to be as close to the reference site as possible. So this figure on the right is showing a comparison between mitigated site and the reference site for several different characteristics. And the important takeaway from this is that different wetland characteristics take different times to reach equivalency. So for example, soil organic matter may be very similar to the reference site after only a few years, whereas plant growth or another characteristic may take much longer to reach equivalency with the reference site if they actually reach equivalency at all, which is one of the challenges of mitigation that we'll discuss a little bit further. So once mitigation is deemed to be complete, there's an inspection that's performed prior to certification to determine whether the permit requirements have actually been met. And once this mitigation site is then certified, the mitigation is deemed complete. Next slide, please. Okay, so I've already alluded to the fact that there might be some challenges associated with mitigation. And first, I just want to stress that mitigation cannot always be assumed that mitigation will be 100% successful. And this could be due to a wide variety of factors, including failure to comply with the performance standards in the mitigation design, lack of appropriate monitoring for the site, and it can be very challenging to identify the long-term management and monitoring tasks and also appropriately budget funds for those kind of long-term tasks. And so making sure that there's appropriate funding for the entire mitigation process is a really important and challenging aspect. So generally, there needs to be robust evaluation of compensation performance to make sure that mitigation is going correctly. However, there is a lack of regional scale studies on past mitigation performance that can contribute negatively to some repeated issues with mitigation over time. So the table on the right shows the results from an analysis of 17 mitigation projects in Western Washington and examining their compliance using looking at several different conditions. So the conditions that are generally thought of as negative, I highlighted in red, and the conditions that are generally thought of as positive, such as being in compliance with these regulatory requirements or monitoring is done when required, are highlighted in green. So I want to bring your eyes to two percentages on there, showing that 29% of those 17 sites were out of compliance, and 65% were not functioning ecologically, which brings me to my next point. So go ahead, next slide, please, Kristine. Which is that compliance with the performance or regulatory standards does not necessarily ensure that ecological function within these sites is restored. And previous reviews have found that mitigation led to an actual net loss of wetlands, whether you were considering this by total acreage or ecosystem function. And so, for example, only 21%, one review found that only 21% of mitigation sites met ecological equivalency. And indeed, wetlands that were 6 to 100% compliant with permits were found to only be 0 to 67% functional. Just again, indicating that this compliance with the regulatory standards doesn't necessarily indicate that the ecosystem is functioning the way that it was designed to do. So for a California example, flood storage and water quality improvement are two main ecosystem functions of wetlands. However, they were only required to be replaced in less than 10% of California wetland mitigation permits, indicating that there's this disconnect with some of these performance standards or the design of the mitigation and actual useful ecosystem functions. So as another example, vegetation is very commonly used to monitor mitigation sites and determine mitigation success, but it's not always a good indicator of ecosystem function. So this table is showing several parameters measured in 110 wetland mitigation projects in California. And you can see that for most of the sites, they saw that vegetation was kind of the key parameter that was measured. Whereas in many fewer sites, the mitigation actually examined the water quality, the soil characteristics, or the invertebrates. So all of these things are part of an ecosystem, a wetland ecosystem, and they're all really important functions to make sure that things are working properly. And so this is, again, just showing some of this disconnect with and challenges that mitigation might have. So next slide, please. Okay, so in addition, I already alluded to this a little bit, but ecological equivalency may take longer than the 5-year required period for mitigation monitoring. So one study found that there was about 9 years to hydrological similarity in vernal pools when comparing a mitigation site to a reference site. And this table is showing additional structural components of wetlands and also the range of years it took for these given components to be established. And so again, you can look at the ranges of years, and while a few of them are, may be established in 2 to 3 years, some of these are taking greater than 10 years or 30 years, or some may never actually reach ecological equivalency during the time that was examined. So again, this is just pointing that some of these standards should be altered in mitigation to make sure that they're being as effective as possible. So in addition, some non-native species can dominate mitigation sites, which kind of further impedes the ecosystem functions that the mitigation was designed to do, as well as Kristine mentioned briefly, wetland ecosystems with very specific combinations of biology or soil characteristics or other chemical and physical components may be very difficult to create in a man-made fashion and also difficult to maintain. So next slide, please. So I think I turn it back to Kristine here, and she's going to talk about some of the recommendations that we found in the literature.
Yep, thank you, Lillian. So these should come as no surprise based on what Lillian has mentioned. There are many more recommendations than what is listed here, but these are just some of the ones that continuously came up in some of the papers that we were looking at. So as Lillian mentioned, there's a tendency to favor vegetation indices when creating performance standards for mitigation sites. This is because they're among the easiest to measure. It's pretty easy to look at, percent cover. However, there is a need to expand the range of those so that when we're looking at adaptive management ways to manage these sites, you're getting a better picture of whether or not functional equivalency is actually being met. Additionally, there needs to be better studies of these sites at regular intervals, as opposed to maybe just once every 5 years. Some of the reports that we were looking at mentioned that sometimes sites are never actually visited at all. So having that be a stronger requirement would be helpful for actually making sure that compliance is being met. Lastly, some of these mitigation ratios are specifically based on acreage. So 1 acre equals 1 credit, things like that, but that's not necessarily reflected of the habitat value of those mitigated acres for specific endangered species. And so when that data is available for species, it would be more helpful to set the mitigation ratios accordingly so that the amount of acres that are being conserved cover some of the land that those species would actually use. And then we also came across this recommendation that creating a geospatial database where it's easier to track where these mitigation projects are occurring would be helpful for actually understanding, maybe even finding reference sites for new mitigation projects. So lastly, we want to go over some of the knowledge gaps that also frequently appeared during our literature review. These are not all of them, but these are some of the ones that were most common. And so one of the ones that would be most helpful, I think, would be more guidelines for habitat creation. So one of the reasons that habitat creation tends to not be considered as reliable or more risky is because there needs to be improved guidelines for how to implement those measures to actually create new habitats. So that's missing. And so a regional specific guideline for how to create new wetlands would be helpful. And then one of the things we came across was just that there needs to be more studies beyond the 5 years that's required for monitoring. And this is because one of the most comprehensive ones was the National Research Council 2001 evaluation, where they went through and actually looked at all of the compensatory mitigation projects from the beginning of permitting to 2001. But there are very few of those studies that actually follow what happens long term to these mitigation sites. And then lastly, reference sites are the bread and butter of monitoring in terms of that's what everything is compared to. So more comprehensive analysis of what those reference sites should look like, how they're performing would be helpful for developing accurate or more attainable performance measures. So with that said, these are our references, and we're happy to take any questions.
Okay, I want to first of all thank you both for an absolutely tremendous presentation. It's extremely informative, and I know it really helped me a lot. I see there's a lot of questions, but I'll take the chair's, the past chair's prerogative to ask the first one. And this may seem like a dumb question, and I think you kind of referred to it, but when you're doing restoration, or particularly getting banking credits, if I destroy a wetland in California, can I rebuild one in Wisconsin? Or is there some more specific requirements that it's actually within the exact same watershed, specifically the same watershed, and specifically so that critters, and does it need to be virtually then interconnected, even the banking?
So I can take that one, Lillian. So the we didn't have enough time to go into all of the nuances with mitigation banking, but you are correct in that you can't just decide to do the mitigation somewhere in Wisconsin. So all mitigation banks have a service area that defines where that mitigation will occur. So for example, a site in California, if you use a mitigation bank there, will likely have a specific geographic area within California. So it may not occur within the project area where the impacts will occur, but it will be in California, and ideally it will be with a similar wetland. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and I guess I'm wondering if it needs to be in the same exact watershed itself, or is it just a geographic area?
It can be, yes. So different mitigation banks will have like a map of where they're allowed to release credits for, if that makes sense.
Okay, I'll go to
Yeah,
Joe.
and
Go ahead.
sorry, I'll just jump in real quick with one more thing. So generally the requirements is that wherever possible, it needs to be within the same watershed. So they do actually have requirements where the ideal situation is that it is within the same watershed. As Kristine said, it might not be directly where the impacts are being had, but it does need to have fairly good reason of why it can't be in the same watershed if it's not in the same watershed.
Okay, we'll go to Joe and then Tanya.
Yeah, thank you for excellent presentation. You guys did a marvelous job. I have a question about, a few questions. One is that, there are three things you mentioned about the wetland mitigation methods. One is the permittee kind of sanctions or responsible mitigation. And that one you mentioned that you don't, once you get the permit, you don't have to, there's no monitoring after that. Is that correct, if I understand correct, that there's no special way of ensuring that this will be happening? The other two, people were looking at, but this one, it was not happening. Is that the reason that many of our 53% or so went unmonitored or unsupervised type thing when you mentioned? The second thing is that you also mentioned these are mostly data prior to 2001 from the National Research Council. Given the movement we have, the environmental movement, maybe things have changed. Is that the possibility thereafter? And the third thing is that this will be excellent topic for the ISB to take over as a special review. It looks like you guys did a lot of legwork, and it will be easy for you to proceed. So I'll shut up my mouth. Thanks.
So I can take a stab at those questions. So that is correct that there was a time period before 2001 where, the minute a project was certified, the permittee was no longer responsible for maintaining that site, which means there is no guarantee after certification that that site is meeting those performance standards in perpetuity. So that has since changed. We didn't have time to go into it, but after that National Research Council report in 2001, in 2008, the US Army Corps of Engineers and the EPA issued the 2008 mitigation rule. And this was in direct response to that report, where they recommended a bunch of things, including strengthening performance standards, introducing adaptive management requirements, introducing stewardship requirements, things like that for all of those different mechanisms, permitting responsible in lieu fee programs, mitigation banks. So now post 2008, there is a requirement to consider long-term management needs, long-term monitoring needs, adaptive management needs, et cetera. But as Lillian mentioned, it's difficult to estimate how much that would cost or what that would actually entail. And so there's still this very much gray area of, well, after a project is certified, if 10 years later down the road, invasive species take over, who pays for that? Is it still the permittee? It's not theirs anymore. So those can all be stipulated as part of the permit conditions, and it tends to be project specific, but that is partially why in lieu fee programs and mitigation banks are somewhat preferred, because that long-term stewardship is a little bit more secure. There is now a way where permittees who do permittee responsible mitigation can transfer like their deeds, like I think it's like a conservation easement, something like that, where they transfer it to a nonprofit so that there's a guarantee there of long-term care.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in real quick to confirm what Kristine said of just that generally there is this monitoring requirement, especially according to the 2008 rule. So there is this monitoring requirement where for the first 5 years, you're supposed to be monitoring the success of the site. And that's where those kind of before certification that, those performance standards are being examined. And then that's when certification comes in when the mitigation is deemed complete. However, usually there is also this kind of longer term, as Kristine said, it's very suggested, heavily suggested that there is some maintenance of the site as well as long-term monitoring. However, especially because monitoring can be very expensive, sometimes those only happen at 5-year intervals, which, as we all know, ecology can change very rapidly, even within 1 year. And so it doesn't necessarily, mean that the site is going to stay stable, as well as some of the issues with mitigation, as I explained, are that even though these monitoring requirements are set, it doesn't necessarily mean that these permits are going to be in compliance. Mm-hmm. So just because they're actually there and the standards exist, it still doesn't mean that the entities responsible will necessarily follow through. And this could be anywhere from lack of funding, as Kristine mentioned, or just any other number of reasons that could come up.
Thank you.
Okay, Tanya, and then Tom.
Yeah, thanks, Kristine and Lillian, for such great work and sharing your highlights of this with us. I really learned a lot, and just grateful for the effort you put into this. And I think, one of the key takeaways that what's kind of ecologically and scientifically kind of ideal for wetland mitigation is often not what's required by policy or by law is important for us to consider. I guess I was wondering if you had any time to look into some of the requirements at the state level in California specifically. I know the state of California, I think in 2014, the State Water Resources Control Board developed a wetland mitigation policy. I'm probably not citing the policy properly, but partly in response to some of the federal debates that have gone on over how we even define wetlands. So this has come up in Supreme Court cases. There's currently a Supreme Court case that was just heard over even the definition of wetlands. And, we've had these issues just come up over and over again, I think, in some of these legal questions around, do marshy areas count as wetlands? Do seasonal streams count as wetlands? What is the definition of a wetland that would fall under the 404 regulations under the Clean Water Act? But my understanding is that California's tried to kind of overcome some of those debates by having their own definition of what constitutes a wetland and being a little more generous in those definitions. But what I don't know is, are the requirements for any wetland mitigation that would fall under any state level policy, do those go above and beyond what federal policy would require? And are we seeing more rigorous state policy for wetland mitigation in the state of California? Is that something you've looked into or seen anything on that, just out of curiosity?
So we haven't started looking yet at any state versus federal requirements, but one of the things that did come up is that regulatory uncertainty is very much a concern for mitigation bank sponsors, in-lieu fee program sponsors. It can change how much a credit is worth, making it either worth less, and then mitigation banks, are not able to continue their work. Same thing with in-lieu fee sponsors. So that's as much as I've looked into it, but perhaps Lillian has looked into it a little bit more. So that is something that we could look into. Yes.
Yeah, so thanks, Tanya. That's a really interesting point. So again, we didn't really get into the state regulations yet, and part of that has to do with I think we're going to have a really informative presentation next month, I believe, about some maybe more California and Delta specific mitigation and restoration that's going on. So hopefully some light will be shed at that time. However, I did see, so I think maybe some of the federal cases you were talking about, so there's been a lot of talk about this definition of waters of the United States. I'm not sure if that's what you were specifically referring to, but technically this Clean Water Act and the Section 404 is covering waters of the United States, which has a very, very technical definition, primarily based on water that might be used either for in-state or international commerce, essentially. And so, but then there's also requirements about, tidal waters are covered, and then also some of their tributaries, and there's a whole bunch of nuances to this definition. And I think one of the things that I saw was this definition has actually they're proposing to modify it, and they've actually gone through the public comment process, and I haven't seen any updates since then, which could just be that I haven't come across them yet. So I will say that. But I do think that there's some really important information about potentially state requirements being a little bit more strict, or maybe a little bit more detailed to set up these regulations for California. So that's a really good point. And hopefully we can provide you some additional information in the future.
Yeah, thanks. Now, you've done great work so far. Just curious about those kind of local policy issues. Thanks.
Okay, Tom.
I've really appreciated the presentation. I learned a lot from it. My question has to do with whether or not you encountered any references to climate change as a consideration in the restoration. Because when you made the observation that some of these restorations take decades to become effective, the Clean Water Act started with a stationary climate. We're clearly living in an unstationary one. And I'm just curious whether or not that's starting to impact how people restore wetlands, particularly in coastal and estuarine regions.
Yeah, so I can answer that or take my first stab at it. So that's a really, really good point, Tom. And so there has been, again, some question with Section 404 to whether it actually includes sea level rise, because some of these sites may actually start becoming under the definition of the waters of the United States with sea level rise, as they develop tidal influence or become more inundated over time. And so technically as far as I know, it doesn't include sea level rise at this time, but there is some talk about whether that will actually be included in the future. So I will talk about it maybe under the specific mention of these reference sites. So I think that's, one of the recommendations that we said in our presentation was that these reference sites be monitored for quite a bit more time so that we have essentially a better baseline. But I think that climate change is a very strong component of that. And so basically learning of, okay, so maybe some of this change happens, but then a whole different climate regime could be reached and things could change very drastically. So making sure that we're accurately paying attention to these reference sites and the changes that are, these kind of global changes that are happening within these reference sites, and then being able to compare those mitigated sites to kind of having that appropriate comparison is going to be really important. So I think that while we didn't mention it specifically in this presentation, that's kind of a big undercurrent of a lot of the issues with mitigation, is kind of all of this change that's happening, and then basically trying to keep up with this mitigation to appropriately kind of create these functions. So I don't know if Kristine has other comments as well.
Not many, just pretty much reaffirm that it wasn't as required pre the 2008 mitigation rule, but after that, it's something that's considered at the discretion of the permittee or the in lieu fee, sponsor or the mitigation bank. So it's not a strict requirement that any of the mitigation that's considered needs to, be resilient to climate change. But that is something that there's some language about how that should be considered, but it's more of a suggestion than it is like a formal requirement. And I think if that was to be more solidified, it would need to somehow probably be tied to performance standards in some way.
Yeah, that's interesting. I really kind of think mankind is at a tipping point right now. We're going from a stationary world to an unstationary world, particularly in terms of climate and sea level, and our tools and our approaches are based on the stationary world, and they're just not going to work in the future.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Diane, I'm sorry, Virginia.
So I was wondering what the requirements are for the people or groups who are doing the planning, the design, the implementation, and the monitoring of these mitigation activities, because that's definitely going to affect the quality of the work.
Yeah, so as Kristine mentioned, there are these separate characteristics of mitigation, whether they're actually kind of the first party, where the person or the entity that's impacting the actual area is responsible for completing the mitigation, which is that permittee responsible mitigation. And then there's just the difference of, either in lieu fees or mitigation banks. And I think that's why generally right now mitigation banks are kind of this, mitigation requirements tend to take this tiered approach where first is required these mitigation banks, and then potentially in lieu fees, and then permittee responsible mitigation is kind of the last option, because I think people are, you're right, that different entities that are undertaking this mitigation could have varying success rates. And I think that generally the mitigation banks, because they're kind of these certified entities for creating this mitigation, and they have lots of practice and they have lots of scientists to back it up, they're generally the preferred option, because they, I haven't necessarily seen whether they're more successful, but generally, as Kristine said, there is usually a gain in wetland function from these mitigation banks. So I think there's definitely something to that of the entity that's responsible for the mitigation. It's highly dependent on that entity of whether the mitigation is successful.
So they're certified entities, but they're not required to be used? Is that what you're saying?
Sorry.
Kristine, do you want to answer that about mitigation banks per se?
Yes. So, oh, okay. So about mitigation banks. Yes. So mitigation banks will generally work with the core to look at and develop performance milestones. So the core signs off on those milestones before mitigation banks are actually able to sell credits to permittees to meet their compliance objectives. Is that what you're asking?
Well, that's part of it, but it seems like there could be a big business of doing all parts of mitigation. And, some people might want to get into it just for the money and not really have the skills. And is there any way to prevent people that don't have the skills from engaging in this work? Are there requirements for the groups and people that are doing, all aspects of this work, including the monitoring after it's established?
So generally for all of those different steps, they're usually spelled out in some kind of agreement that is developed in collaboration with the core. So for example, for in lieu fee programs, there's like the instrument, which is basically a formal document that specifies who is going to be responsible for monitoring, how long monitoring occurs, and that's true also for permittee responsible and mitigation banks, where there's a formal document that spells out those details. But in terms of checking qualifications, we haven't run into that yet, but we can look into that.
Well, it sounds like the core is responsible for getting responsible people and groups to do it, from what you say. But if you run across that, it'd be interesting to know. Because I know, for
So-
instance, the Ecological Society of America specifically set up their certification program to make sure that people who were hired to do that kind of work are trained. And some states like Florida requires people have some kind of formal certification to do this kind of work. And I don't
Yeah.
know about others.
We can certainly look into it, but I mean, in terms of actually doing the monitoring, there are various different methods. So for example, the California Rapid Assessment Method, CRAM for short, it's effectively almost like a checklist where you can take that with you in the field and kind of compare to this, but not all projects necessarily use that, which is part of the problem. People use different ways of measuring successful mitigation, but there are like established methodologies for how to compare against a reference site. And so hopefully whoever's doing the monitoring would be using one of those.
Okay, Joe.
Yeah, now we all kind of preoccupied with this EIR. And one of the things is that most of the time when they have action, they have significant impacts. And the way they get around it is by mitigation, and then it becomes less than significant to LTS level. And that's how they try to get that less than significant level. And also they kind of mentioned that, so they have various ways which are not very well enunciated in the EIR, because I didn't read the whole 30 chapters, but the chapters I read, the mitigation was not given that amount of in-depth. Probably they are still planning, that might be the reason. And also they mentioned that they will have also mitigation methods for mitigation. So when mitigations have some kind of effect, they have mitigation method for that, the offspring from the mitigation. So they were mentioning that, but never discussed in detail in the chapters I was reading. Are there any procedures or methods that you check or predict what's happening with mitigation and then come up with plans to mitigate those mitigation effects? Is that a common practice, or is it something developing?
So I think that when it comes to mitigation, that's one of I think you hit the nail on the head with that's one of the harder things to do, which is trying to predict how a mitigation site will perform over time to actually give you no net loss. So in general, it's all in comparison to the reference site. So ideally, you would develop your mitigation process, or what needs to be there based on an adequate reference site. So that's a lot of what Lillian talked about. We're choosing what that is and designing according to that is really important for actually ensuring no net loss and functional equivalency. But being able to predict whether or not that will work, there are some more reliable method, right? So restoration tends to be a lot easier in terms of guaranteeing functional equivalency as opposed to trying to create a wetland from scratch. So there's things like that, but in terms of like a model where you can put in, your starting variables and hopefully predict whether a functional wetland will come out, that's much more difficult to do. And I don't think that we've run across something like that yet, Lillian, correct me if I'm wrong, where they've been able to guarantee X amount of success based on having this set of performance standards, for example.
Okay, because that's the reason, because you get a little bit frustrated that you have these, all the effects, and then they kind of talk about the mitigation and mitigation of mitigation actions. It's just not very in depth they talk about. That's what I asked, whether are there any examples we can have a look, or in that sense, whether is it a acceptable or developed practice. But thank you.
Okay, Jay.
Thanks, and thank you very much for this wonderful presentation and really excellent work. It's really a nice synthesis of a lot of different things on the subject. Hopefully that this can become a basis for maybe you all putting together a good paper, professional paper on the subject, perhaps focused on the context of California. When I look around, I see that tremendous amounts of our environmental efforts are on restoring wetlands and trying to bring wetlands back, as well as trying to mitigate the losses of wetlands, the few remaining wetlands, I should say. And so I think in California's different climate and different kind of species conditions and ecology, I think means that you could probably have a really nice paper that would be widely read if you focused on the California context with many of these issues. And that paper might be useful in the context of a great starting point for a science board review that would allow us to go even further than what you all are, the excellent work you all are doing. The other thought I have on this is that it's not enough. We have, as Thomas mentioned, climate change. We have a lot of invasive species, as you all have mentioned. Even if we exactly mitigated all of our wetlands, we would probably still see declines in our ecosystems. And so I'm curious to see what you all think about how can we use mitigation programs to gather resources and maybe improve wetlands and improve the location of new wetlands so that they might fit into a bigger context of a more adaptable ecosystem for the future, given climate change and given that we're going to have all these invasive species coming in. And I mean that in terms of sustainability and adaptability, not only from a pure biological, ecological perspective, but the kind of institutions and finance resources and expertise resources that one will need to muster to move this ecosystem successfully into the future, more successfully into the future. Those aspects I think are in some ways more difficult to overcome than the pure ecology of it all. But anyway, you guys have just done a great job stating the state of the art and the state of the concerns. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I agree with Jay. I think taking this to some sort of a paper or something would be, you've done such a tremendous job and really clarified a lot of the issues. I can't resist asking this question. I noticed when you're talking about wetland function, that the word fish was often mysteriously missing from all of your slides. Is it mean that, and frankly, even though we try and restore vegetation and stuff like that, ultimately a lot of the impacts on fish. And is there movements in that direction to try and look at fish functions as functional equivalents in terms of mitigation efforts?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I should have suspected a fish question was coming. Um, I think that's a really interesting point. As far as the research that I've done about the mitigation, it does seem like the more traditional ecosystem functions of wetlands are mentioned. So vegetation, hydrology, soil characteristics and chemistry, and other physical characteristics. I think that one of the challenges with mitigation is that it's not necessarily, even if you replace all these ecosystem functions, it's not necessarily true that the animals you want to then kind of live in that habitat will come. And so I think that's maybe in part because we still are figuring out some specifics of perfect ideal conditions for a lot of these species. I will say that most of the fish specific mitigation work has been done with these endangered species. So if the species is protected, it's much more likely to have a specific call out in this mitigation to basically create habitat that's designed for that particular species. As far as the role that fish play in the ecosystem in a more holistic fashion, I haven't seen a lot of inclusion of that itself as an ecosystem function. So the role that they either play in trophic ecology or the carbon cycle or anything like that, I haven't really explicitly seen any specific inclusion of fish in that way. I don't know if that answers your question. I think it could be a really interesting part of maybe bringing out some maybe more holistic ecosystem functions that are not necessarily the ones that are traditionally examined as far as wetland function goes. So I think that's a really good point. Hopefully that answers some of your question.
It answers my suspicion, and it reaffirms my suspicion, I guess. But the the question I would have in like even in terms of your endangered species, if you're taking out a wetland, destroying a wetland that an endangered species might use, and then go to a mitigation bank, are they listed in such a way that you have to get a credit that for wetlands that actually have this species in it, or is that a criteria at all? And you may not know that.
Oh, so different mitigation banks will offer different types of credits. So for example, some mitigation banks will offer wetland credits, some mitigation banks will offer conservation credits for a particular species. So yes, if there's an endangered species that is being mitigated for, hopefully they're planning on using a conservation bank that is specifically catered to protecting that species.
And I have to ask a simple math question again. And if you're taking out 100 acres, and going to a bank, whatever it is, that already has been restored, and buying credits, aren't you still losing that 100 acres? Isn't there a net 100-acre loss? Because if you go to banking system, you're not creating anything, you're just buying credits, right?
Yeah, so this has to do with crediting and the way credit and debt works with mitigation banks, where there is an actual set cap of the amount of credits that a mitigation bank can sell based on however many acres it has available. So there is a point at which it could be that particular bank can no longer sell credits because it's already given away all 100 acres or things like that. And now it needs to focus on preserving different functions. So that can happen. So that is something we came across where there's a finite number of wetlands left that could even qualify to have credits available. So that needs to be a consideration at some point in time, probably now, is what happens when that, 52% of wetlands have already been lost in the contiguous, United States. So for what we have left, how many credits can actually exist from those sites? Because not all of them are at full pristine condition. Some of them are likely already disturbed and may not even necessarily be good reference sites at this point. So yeah, I think you hit the nail right on the head, which is that mitigation banking is a finite way of doing this. And at some point, there probably needs to be attention paid towards wetland creation and making sure that guidelines for how to do that well for these different types of wetlands needs to kind of be improved or be brought up online.
Yeah,
Okay.
and I'll just add in that, like, what Jay was saying about how do we actually, when we're talking about creating wetlands, how do we actually create wetlands that then are going to be robust in the foresight of ecological change, and how are we going to actually create those sites that will then account for this climate change or account for that, and then kind of, I don't know, be able to, survive the future of what's changing, as well as kind of designing this of, how we want to foresee wetlands in the future. So I think maybe with mitigation, a lot of emphasis is placed on how wetlands used to be. And so again, this mismatch of things are being compared to and designed for how things used to be, kind of to what Tom was mentioning of this very static condition, and then moving instead to creating these mitigated sites that are then kind of how we want the future to be and how we want ecosystems to be in the future, so that they'll be a little bit more robust in the face of climate change. So bringing together kind of everybody's point.
Okay, well, I want to again thank the both of you for an excellent presentation and discussion. Edmund, if you don't mind, I'd like to have you, when this video goes live, take the URL clip of this and send it to the 3 or 4 board members that couldn't be here for this, and suggest that they have a look at it. I think it'd be very valuable for all of us to get on the same page. Before we go to public comment, I'd like to acknowledge Obey has now joined us. And Obey, do you have any new declarations?
No, I don't. Thank you, Steve.
Okay, and I guess we can move on to public comments on this, Edmund.
Yes, we have one from Deirdre Desjardins. Deirdre, I have unmuted your microphone. Please provide your public comment. Thank you.
Yeah, it's Deirdre Desjardins with California Water Research. And yeah, I just wanted to say what a phenomenal job the postdocs did. And this is an argument for the Delta ISB should have postdocs. It's amazing. I did want to say the issue of mitigation for loss of wetlands was a major issue in the water fix hearing. And the reason is the water board needs to have a finding that the project would be consistent with the public trust. And the public trust includes birds and terrestrial species, as well as fish. And there was testimony by the County of Sacramento that they were concerned that, or the City of Sacramento, I believe, that they were concerned that mitigation banks for development in Sacramento already had taken up the wetlands mitigation that was needed, and there weren't enough mitigation banks for the project. I worked with David Fries, who's the conservation chair for the San Joaquin Audubon Society, and has birded in the Delta for 30 years. He said, I'd like to read a section of his testimony and I'll get it all to you. One cannot destroy habitat for critical species and attempt to, quote, revive, unquote, that species at some later date by creating new and perhaps equivalent habitat. New habitat must be created and the threatened species established in that setting before older established habitat is destroyed. Construction of the tunnels over a projected 13-year period will destroy and disrupt critical habitat to such an extent that survival of critical species may not wait for new and perhaps suitable alternative living and breeding sites. Fact is, most of the space for habitat rehabilitation has already been altered or encroached upon to the extent that habitat mitigation may not be possible. We cannot afford to lose what little working habitat already exists. So I know there was a significant change in the site of the Water Fix project, and they also made an effort to have better sites for disposal of the tunnel muck. So hopefully some of this is addressed. Dave was also particularly concerned about destruction of trees, riparian trees that are used as nesting habitat, because you can't plant immature trees and have those replace riparian forest. So I'll try to get you some more. I'm getting a large number of things on my plate to synthesize and get to the board, but I can hopefully at least get you some of the relevant testimony. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that, Deidre. We are scheduled for a quick 10-minute break, so let's make
Steve?
it. Yes.
We also have one more public comment.
Okay.
This is from Natasha Nelson with the Delta Protection Commission. She provided a written comment to be read into the meeting record. Please look for improving habitats along Delta levees, a review of past projects and recommended next steps, published by the Delta Stewardship Council, January 2016 in the library. Just passing this paper along as it covers most of the monitoring and design questions in today's presentation. There is a well-vetted review of recommended next steps. So that concludes her comment, and we will pass along the report and also provide a link to it on today's meeting event accordion. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Edmund. We will take a 10-minute break now to return at 10:27. Okay, I think we're all back. Virginia, are you still there?
Yeah, I guess I had my mute on. I'm here, but I'm eating lunch. So.
Welcome back, everyone. We'll move on to item number 4, which is our discussion of the Delta Conveyance Project. I think all of you are familiar with the background to this. Back 2.5 years ago, in April of 2020, we let DWR that it was our intent to review this EIR, but also highlighted areas from previous reviews on Delta Conveyance that DWR should consider in preparing this particular EIR. And we subsequently received updates from DWR at least 4 times since then. And as you know, they have hosted a couple of public meetings, one on September 12th, which I attended, another one on September 22nd. Our original comments were due October 27th, and we submitted a request for a 30-day extension, but DWR has subsequently given a 50-day extension for everyone for public comments and extended the October 27th deadline to December 16th. So what that's done for us is to stretch out our particular scale and deadlines for us, and giving us some more opportunities to go a couple of extra rounds in terms of the various versions we might be looking at. I know many of you have been commenting and doing edits and adding individual comments on chapters and general comments and that will continue. Let me spell out the current timeline. You can still add those comments and on the current draft and that through tomorrow, October 14th. Then the writing team, which I think is Lisa and myself and Jay until October 31st, will take all of those and put in comments into a second draft, which would be completed around October 24th. That will be a draft that will then be available for the public to look at, and it'll be the draft that we'll be discussing specifically at our early November meeting, at which time we will all board members will have an opportunity then to have that discussion in early November, and then have another look at that public draft and add additional comments and writing and submit additional things until November 14th, at which time the writing team will again take it and do another version, which will be submitted for another as another public draft on December 1st. We are then scheduled to meet on December 8th to officially vote on that document, to accept it as our review, subject to minor edits and so forth that we will have an opportunity for a few days after that to add to that. So for your calendars, think about it as rushing to get comments in by tomorrow. Then when you receive the second version, you will have the next version. You will have approximately 2 to 2.5 weeks to continue to add and edit and write things. Then a couple of weeks later, you'll get what is pretty much near the final version on December 1st, and you'll have last minute opportunities to make any corrections. We will have probably a full day or half a day or major day of face-to-face discussions at our November meeting, early November meeting, the 3rd and 4th, which I will talk about later. So that's where we are. And what we thought we'd do today was to open the floor up just to discuss some fairly general ideas or topics or things that have come up in the various course of discussions. And I'll just list these 4 questions, I think, rather than go through them one at a time, and open the floor to comments and discussion and so forth. Oh, good. I don't have to read them. The basic discussion questions are shown here. And the first one is that given the various alternatives that are being proposed, is there an equal balance or a fair balance on how those different alternatives were evaluated? Was each alternative evaluated in a fair and comprehensive way compared to all the other alternatives? The second question is there a realistic evaluation of actual impacts? If you were to start from scratch and say, okay, I'm gonna do this modification, what are the impacts you would you would think you'd want to look at and what should be looked at, and does the EIR look at those impacts in order to make a informed decision later on. Third has to do with adaptive management. Is it where is it used? Where is it needed? More importantly, where is it needed? Is it fully documented and fully explained in the operations and mitigation in its various components? And then finally, are there major areas that cut across chapters that we need to address? That way, I guess that we don't need to address separately, but that major areas that we need to address separately. For example, mitigation, as Joe mentioned, mitigation is in a variety of different places for a variety of different things. Should we discuss that as a specific topic? And I know there are others that we've talked about that are in our current draft, but we want to make sure one last look at that and see if we're missing something that sort of rises to the level of a general discussion on this EIR versus the specifics that might be embedded in a particular chapter. So I guess we have about an hour or less to just openly discuss and brainstorm on these ideas. So the floor is open on these questions. Okay, we can move on to the next topic now. Oh, Joe, go ahead. You're on mute, Joe.
Sorry, yes, I was expecting that somebody who is very familiar with Delta will start the conversation, but maybe I will start. One thing I kind of noticed was that it was the only the qualm I had was that how these alternatives selected out of 20s or I think 20 something different alternatives proposed were not mentioned at all. They basically kind of whittled down everything into 9. How this 9 came about out of many, many permutations was actually something that could have been mentioned. Once they had 9, I think they discussed various kinds of problems arising or environmental issues arising with respect to those 9 were discussed well. At least in great depth, they discussed. Whether they handle how to address them is a different issue, but certainly the discussion was in depth. So I would like to see something to the effect of how many, many permutations they had came down to 9.
Now, I know that I think at one of our DWR presentations, and someone correct me if I'm wrong, they did talk about that a little bit, but you think it's worth a specific question, see if they have a document that explains that to WR?
Yes, somewhat of document so people know, very transparent how this came about.
Doesn't it come up in one of the appendices? Or am I like, I mean, some of the description of that process for how they whittled that down, if I recall, was buried in an appendix. But
I think somewhere in chapter 3 there was some discussion.
Yeah, there is some discussion, but it's not in the main body of the report from my recollection, and that description is not very thorough, perhaps, in that appendix.
Yeah, I saw somewhere, but not that whole 21. Did they mention, Tanya, about the whole 21?
I need to go look, Joe.
Okay, all right.
Okay, well, let's make that an action item. Maybe Joe and Tanya can see if they can discover that text to start.
Yeah. I've seen that too, and I think it's there. They mentioned 20 through a public process they came up with.
But I think step 1 is to find that text again and then see if we still want further information. And if so, we can send a note to DWR to see if they have any further documentation of that process if we think we need it. So work that through Edmund. Okay, Tom.
My concern is similar to Joe's, maybe a little more expansive. I just feel like what it is they start with, we're going to build a tunnel. Where do we put it? And there are more alternatives than that. And I think I wrote some words to that effect for our review, and I think Jay has commented on that as well. So I think it does warrant more discussion.
Okay, Jay. You're on mute.
I'm just going to pile on here. I do think that in the environmental impact statements, or the federal NEPA requirement does require a scoping process where you narrow down on alternatives and have some documentation on that. But we haven't seen that, so there might be some additional documentation on the scoping of the alternatives that they selected in there. But I'll just to echo what Joe and Tom have said, I was hoping to see a document that would lead a public conversation on what to do with conveyance in the Delta, where there are really quite a wide variety of alternatives that are commonly discussed. And even if some of those alternatives are really pretty poor technically, and in terms of environmental impact, this would be an ideal opportunity to demonstrate their inadequacy relative to whatever their preferred alternative would be in the end. But I do think that the public and the stakeholders all deserve that kind of examination, comparative examination of a wider range of alternatives than, as was put, where should the tunnel be and how big should it be? Among a pretty narrow range of alignments, actually. Although I do think that the range of tunnel sizes is reasonable, there are certainly a variety of other conveyance alternatives for getting water over, under, around, or through the Delta, other than just a tunnel.
Okay, Obe.
Yeah, good afternoon. Mine is a little different. Concern I have had is, twofold. One is this use of mid-2040 as a sort of the planning horizon, which actually the analysis period lasted from 2020s to 2060, if I recall. That seems like not too far into the future, but a bigger concern is this whole idea of looking at alternate climate futures. I think Tom mentioned the non-stationarity, which absolutely is something we need to think about. The way, as I read it in the EIR, how it was done was basically you looked at the climate models and you look at the median change, and basically went back and adjusted the historical time period to reflect some sort of a median change. And to me, that only gives you one alternate scenario, not multiple climate futures that should be looked at in a big project like this. And that is my main concern, I think.
Okay, Tanya, and maybe Edmund, if you could put those questions back up again, just so we can look at them.
This was just a follow-up on my response to Joe. In Appendix 3A, there is some discussion of the initial screening they did to filter out several alternatives that didn't meet their initial screening criteria. So there is in Table 3A2 some of those alternatives, but I do think that discussion of what those are could have been more explicitly drawn out in the report itself. So we might want to just look at that again more closely.
Yes, Tom. You're
Muted.
mute. You're on mute, Tom.
Sorry about that. I'm looking at a small me on the screen right now. Um, another area that I thought we might be able to do better is on the major impacts. I don't think they've done an adequate job of estimating the carbon dioxide greenhouse gas emissions from the project. I mean, there's an awful lot of cement and concrete in this project, and I noticed in the revision of the comments I put in, it got maybe toned down a little bit, but I think that's a important impact, particularly since it's state policy to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, to become a carbon neutral state.
Yeah, I think, Tom, if you see any of you, if you see and I want you to keep looking at the revisions carefully, because as we do these revisions, you know, there's things are shuffled around and moved to the different parts and stuff. And if you see something that you feel strongly about or think is a major point, by all means, reinsert it back in and let us know. You know, this we don't have any. The writers have absolutely no veto power on any word, and so I think that we want to make sure that this document encompasses all of your evaluations into it, and so forth. If it comes an issue that we want to debate, whether this is a big issue or a little issue, we can have that debate. But I think that right now we haven't gone through those debates, so I think it's a matter of don't trust us, and make sure you keep looking at this thing to make sure it evolves in a way that you're comfortable with.
Yeah, I didn't look at the whole draft. I just went through to see how you had handled my comments, and my impression was that you had taken a slightly different approach and were looking at it in a systems manner, you know, it's sort of an overall thing. So that I thought maybe the way it was being organized was being changed.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure the chair did all of that, so I can. Who's not here? Who's not
Our
here?
vacation will come to an end.
Okay, well, thanks for bringing that up, and we want to make sure that those things are not lost in any way or diminished. Tanya.
Yeah, I think just in reflecting on those discussion questions on the adaptive management piece, it does seem like, at least in many of the chapters that I looked at, and a lot of the assumptions around determining that impacts might be less than significant were based on plans for mitigation or some sort of change in operations that would address that potential impact. But there was potentially a lot of uncertainty around, you know, whether or not those impacts would be mitigated and would remain less than significant. And I think that, you know, a more attention to an adaptive management approach to ensure that those impacts remain less than significant would be critical. And I didn't see a lot of that developed in the chapters that I reviewed.
Yeah, I think we are moving towards having a specific section on adaptive management because it's such an important component of anything that's done in the Delta. And I think it would be important to see how robust the adaptive management approach is being applied in terms of the CIR. Jay.
I had a similar thought as I was going through quite a few of the chapters that this is a pretty big project in a pretty complex and sensitive part of the world. And as illustrated by the fact that there's 30 chapters on different types of impacts. What's the probability you've estimated what those future impacts are perfectly? What's the probability that all of the mitigations that you've earnestly put forward are actually going to work? The probabilities are not one. So one thing that I was kind of disappointed in thinking about that was that I didn't see a sort of a general mechanism or a set of mechanisms that the project is proposing, project sponsors are proposing for financing and assessing and mitigating as new things come up. Because they should be expected. We should expect to see some surprises with this project in terms of environmental impacts and other changes. And it would behoove, I think, the project sponsors to have set aside some resources and expertise and a little bit of institutional capability for assessing those and addressing them as they develop over time.
Thanks, Jay. I did want to remind anyone who's listening or taking detailed notes that this is officially a brainstorming session. So don't take anybody's individual comments as a definitive statement from the board. We're just looking at ideas and having an open discussion. Obe.
Yeah, another area that I think maybe the report could improve on is, this whole concept of sending excess water south to some storage somewhere is probably a good idea. When I say excess, that meets all the other requirements, both environmental and water supply. It will be nice to see what is the lift in terms of reliability of the water supply that the particular selected alternative would provide over some of the others. And also another aspect would be, it would have been nice to see some economic in terms of analysis in terms of economic terms, which we didn't see any of it, to my knowledge, in the report.
Okay, Joe?
Yeah, so since we were talking about the adaptive management, I kind of found it a bit disappointing because time to time adaptive management, the word is mentioned, but how it will be implemented is not very well articulated. And then I thought maybe this is a project which has to go forward, so do monitoring and things of that sort. They don't have time, but at least in the mitigation strategies, I would have liked to see some adaptive management implemented so that they can have monitoring and keep on refining the impacts or the mitigation impacts. So that would have been quite nice. So maybe we really should stress the fact that adaptive management is weakly represented unless somebody has some other idea that it has to be brought in to the conversation.
And thanks, Joe, and remind folks that, of course, the board did review adaptive management in the Delta. And in that review, we have very specific recommendations on the approach. And maybe that's something we should refresh our minds about in terms of when we look at adaptive management in this process. Tom.
Yeah, I'd like to third Obe and Jay's comments about economics and financing. One thing that's becoming really important in California is the financing for the high-speed rail. And I think it was the New York Times had an article about whether or not it was even going to be possible to finish it. So I think we ought to at least have that on our list. Whether it belongs in an environmental impact statement, I'm not sure.
Obe, do you have another comment?
Sorry, I forgot to lower my hand. Yeah, sorry.
Any other thoughts or comments? I guess, are people also pretty clear about what the next steps are in the process that we're undergoing? Okay, well, as we move forward, again, we will have a,
Steve,
Yes.
on the next steps, is Edmund going to send out a sort of an instruction with schedule and which document we should be working on?
yeah, hopefully Edmund will keep you very well informed on that. The to re-emphasize the document you're currently contributing to, and you can do that by sending comments to Edmund or go to the document and edit directly. You have until tomorrow, close of business the 14th, to do that. And then you're certainly welcome to keep thinking about ideas, but then that document will be sort of the standing document until the writing team gets together and produces another version of that based on all of your input that would be distributed on or about October 24th. So it gives us 10 days to kind of revise it and put your inputs, but certainly welcome to continue to think and add things and jot things down. But the next time to actually dive into that document would be October 24th, when there'll be should be a revision for you. And that's the version that will be going public and as a draft. And that's the version that we will also be directly discussing at our November 3rd meeting. So, or 4th meeting, whatever it is. And, but you will have October 24th until November 14th. That is a roughly 3 weeks then to add to that particular version, but that'll be your last major shot at it. And then on the 24th, the writing team will take 24th and I'm sorry, on the 14th of November, when your comments will be due, the writing team again will produce another draft, which should be available to you by December 1st. That also will be a public draft, and then that's the draft that would be we'll essentially be voting on a special at our December 8th teleconference. And so any content changes, certainly at the last minute, you'll have some time to do that and make those suggestions at our December 8th meeting, so that we can then, or before that, so we can vote on at least content approval by then. And then that gives us a couple of weeks to polish it and get it in. That makes sense to everybody? And hopefully, Edmund, you can send out those specific dates. And those are only rough dates because of people's schedules and times and so forth. But if you think about it, comments now, then you'll get another version, which you'll have a couple weeks to work on. And then another version, which you'll just have a week or so to look at. That doesn't mean you should stop reading now. You can continue while we're rewriting this. By all means, go through. If we've missed something in this particular version that you thought was important, like Tom suggested, make sure you re-highlight that and let us know, because we'll be putting this together in another version. And meanwhile, if you have things to add to the current version, by all means, keep sending them to Edmund. You know, we won't edit it immediately, but it'll be taken into account in terms of our rewrites. So keep the information coming. Don't stop. Edmund will sort it all out. Any other thoughts or questions on where we are, where we're going? Think again about, in terms of our discussions in November, if there are things that we particularly need to debate, we should think about those. If there's some issues that people want to have a further discussion to get other people's inputs on, and of course we'll want to take into account any public comments we get from our public versions of this as well. So, okay, I think that concludes this discussion. And Edmund, did I miss anything, or we can take public comments now?
Yes, I think we can take public comments now.
Okay, let's do that.
We just have one right now from Deirdre Desjardins. But just as a reminder for members of the public, if you do have public comments, please use the raise hand function in Zoom. And with that, Deirdre, your microphone has been unmuted.
Thank you. Deirdre Desjardins with California Water Research. And I really appreciate the frank and open discussion about alternatives to the tunnel. And yes, it's a major CEQA issue that the project purpose is being defined too narrowly. And there was a lot of hope when it's sort of being segmented. There's a water resilience portfolio that the governor did. And so in some sense, it's sort of being segmented that this is just the part of the process dealing with the state water project reliability. But with recent research pointing towards aridification, there's really a reasonable concern that this isn't looking enough at water supply portfolios and regional water supply reliability, but only narrowly looking at reliability of a state water project, which is difficult for historic reasons. I'm just finishing up a blog post about how the original water rights permits for the water board assumed augmentation of the Sacramento River flows by 900,000 acre feet a year, and this just didn't happen. So there's real concerns that the goals of the project, given aridification and needs of increased outflow to repel salinity with sea level rise, aren't realistic. And the delta is planned to be used, the South Delta pumps by the Central Valley Project, and there's a lot of small towns as well as the city of Fresno that get their water supply from the Central Valley Project, as well as hundreds of thousands of acres of agricultural land. And I don't think this is addressed enough, and it's particularly not integrated with the Delta levy investment strategy that the Stewardship Council is doing, and looking at investments that need to happen in Delta levees to either maintain the current configuration of Delta Islands, or what the hydrology of, let me finish my sentence, what the hydrology, hydrodynamics of the project in the Delta is going to look like if those islands are left to fail. And right now, the way Delta levy investments are going, we're just looking at unplanned abandonment of a lot of Delta islands. And it's not a coherent or realistic strategy, in my opinion. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Deirdre. We'll move on to item number 5, which is reflections from outgoing Delta ISB members. I know at our last in-person meeting, I gave some personal thank yous to publicly to Joe and Jay for their service on the board. Being on this board, and I've been on this board about 8.5 years now, and it's almost always a series of highs and fun and occasional lows. And this is one of the low periods when you have to say goodbye to people that you worked that you've grown to trust and that you grown to work with, and I think in many ways balance a lot of ideas that many of us have. And I think when I first joined the board, I was immediately thrown into an ongoing review of fish and flows, led up by Jay and Joe, and hard to believe doing fish stuff, but they and so I immediately started working with them, and it was just a lot of fun to do that, and I got to really recognize their talents. I've worked with Joe on another board, so I've known him for quite a while. So anyway, I won't say anything more on that regard, other than you guys have done obviously a tremendous job for spending 10 years of your life on this board, and have done tremendous effort on all the reviews you were involved in, and it's really been a lot of fun to work with you. We've asked Joe and Jay to give us some reflections on your 10 years of service, and saged advice on what we should do with our remaining time. So I'll start off with Jay. Want to go first?
Thank you, Steve, for your kind words. I was thinking you all would just have a big celebration. You know, you have more time to talk and less time to listen to me. The Delta Independent Science Board is really an experiment over the last 10 years, a little bit more than 10 years, since it started just a little bit before I joined the board, on trying to provide a formal way of introducing fairly formal scientific assessments at a high level on Delta problems. The conversations about Delta problems always have had a lot of what has been called advocacy science or combat science, and trying to litigate science out in the courts. And so in the 2009 legislation on the Delta Reform Act, the legislation includes the Delta Independent Science Board and an independent lead scientist who's formerly a USGS employee, to try to bring some coherence to the science that's done by many different agencies and many different interests across the Delta, and to provide some higher level expert independent assessment on scientific issues, which is the Science Board. This experiment, I think, has been partly successful. I don't think it's lived up to the hopes of the original legislation, which is not a very damning thing, because this is a really hard problem, and we're still institutionally pretty young about this. So I think we've made a lot of good progress. I think we have a long way to go on this problem, and this, what to me is the explicit and implied mission of the Science Board and the lead scientist. It's been really a pleasure and a challenge at times to be involved in this experiment, and I'm happy to see that this experiment is going to continue without me after my term is expired. We've worked hard to do that at times, but let me sort of go through some quick assessment of some strengths and weaknesses, and some suggestions for adaptive management on our part as we move forward. In terms of strengths, these boards have been incredibly strong as a collection of independent, interdisciplinary scientific experts who are really pretty earnest at trying to do a good job. You know, this is not one of those boards where you just sit back and collect a paycheck. This is really a pretty self-aware group of people that has a lot of expertise and experience with really difficult problems from across the country, and in some cases across the world. So I think the level of expertise that we bring is tremendous. The downside of that expertise is we tend to not have a lot of local expertise, which could tend to jade us, and sometimes you can know too much about problems, and we come in with part of the cost of the independence as a board is that we often do not have a lot of local expertise. But I think the people of California, through the legislature, have wisely just chosen to invest in this kind of an institution. The reports that we've produced, I think, do provide the kind of independent scientific expert scrutiny and perspectives that the many different Delta science programs under the many different Delta agencies and interests need to try to help corral them or bring them a little bit more into a confluence. Our reports seem to have been widely read, widely thought about. Sometimes I feel like we're just a little tugboat pushing on a really big super tanker to try to get some of these disparate agencies to move together. It's a big ship we're trying to move, a big ecosystem of scientific enterprises that we're trying to cajole along. And I think another strength that we have is, and this is really well evidenced by that wonderful report that Lauren Hastings and Edmund Yu and others put together. Allegra, I think, also was part of this, that reviewed what people think about us. So we had an independent review of our independent reviews and our independent review activities, and it came out far more positive. We're far more popular than I ever would expect from a bunch of geeks on a Delta science board. So I think we have a lot of strengths. The weaknesses, as I said, one of them is that we will never have the kind of local expertise that many people would like us to have, and it makes our job much more difficult when we're writing reports because we don't have much local expertise. I think that's just fundamental to our situation, because if we gain too much local expertise, we will be locally jaded. But I think that just makes it incumbent that we make sure we talk to a lot of people, a wide range of people as we do our work. So we, over the 10 years that many of you will be on this board, you will develop much of that kind of local expertise and certainly awareness. The other big weakness we have for our experimental task is that even if we're pretty good at producing scientific input, the agencies really aren't, and the decision-making processes aren't necessarily very explicit or eager to have scientific input. So there's the scientists have a hard time expressing themselves for policymaking and management input, reception, and then the receptors, the policymakers and managers, haven't really organized their processes so that they can digest the input that science and our board as well produces. We have a few exceptions to that, and the legislation being very explicit about us having to review Delta Conveyance projects is probably the major exception to that. So I think the science policy interface is needs to be a two-way street. It shouldn't be just scientists throwing reports over the wall. The people on the other side of maybe we should make some tunnels through the wall from time to time. For us, in terms of adaptive improvements and how we do things, I think there's a lot of things that we should consider in doing this. I do think that we and the Delta Science Program have not been as effective as the legislation had hoped in building a confluence of the agency science programs together so that they're creating a common understanding rather than separate understandings. I think that just takes more work and more dedication on the part of the Delta Science Program and on our part as well in terms of how we phrase and scope our reviews and content of our reviews. In terms of advice for you all as you continue in this experiment, I would recommend you continue to produce independent scientific technical reviews that are needed to make Delta policies and adaptive management more effective in practice. We should support agencies that are seeking to base Delta management on high quality science. We should protect the Delta lead scientists and the staff that support them in trying to develop integrated development of information to serve Delta policymaking, Delta management. They have a very difficult job compared to our job. We're just the reviewers, but the lead scientist and the Delta Science Program have a really tremendously difficult job institutionally and scientifically. So I think we should try to protect them and support them in as many ways as we can. We have to always be mindful that we are working in mostly a political world. We like to live, most of us have sequestered ourselves for the most part in the scientific world, but our work here is really interjections into what is mostly a political world. And we have to be very mindful of the human and bureaucratic challenges of that, and particularly for the Delta being a little bit controversial. We should really pity the policymakers, managers, stakeholders, agency scientists, and the public who work in the Delta and have to make sense of trying to come up with solutions that they hope will work. And any guidance that we can give them to help make their job easier is really important, particularly if we can be articulate and clear about our advice and in making solutions that will work better over the long term is really important. I would eschew risk aversion from agency lawyers that threaten our mission. I think this is very important, not only for us, but also for the other agencies that we work with. The lawyers are well-intentioned, they're trying to do a professional job, but sometimes they make the protection of the mission of our board and of their agencies secondary to a larger risk aversion. And this is a problem that we have certainly experienced. Remember that neither the problems nor solutions really care about our beloved disciplines. I think most people on the board already understand this. Many scientists don't. That they see their discipline as the center of the universe and everything revolves around that. But certainly the problems really don't give a rip about our individual disciplines. It really takes a collection of different ways of thinking to understand problems, these kind of problems, and to pull together effective solutions. And then I guess my final advice would be, don't give up. These problems of the Delta are going to be eternal, and the controversies will always be eternal. We will never solve these problems, but I do firmly believe that our work will make these problems better and the solutions better, and that's a substantial contribution to these kind of inevitable problems. And then to sort of summarize my perspective on all this, Edmund has a picture that I would like him to put up. Edmund? So this is a picture of the Delta Independent Science Board taken on the Halloween of 2014. And since this is our October meeting, this is the closest we're going to get to Halloween while I'm still on the board. And you'll see Joe there and quite a few people that you'll recognize. But it also includes the Delta lead scientist at the time, Peter Goodwin, and the chair of the Delta Stewardship Council, Phil Eisenberg. We decided we would dress up for Halloween, and we had a really great time. And I think this shows the collegiality of the board and its effectiveness, and most importantly, it shows the integration of the lead scientist in the science program with the leadership of the science of the Delta Stewardship Council, political leadership of the Delta Stewardship Council, in many of our activities, and the great support that we've lent to each other over the last decade or so. Thank you all very much, and good luck continuing the experiment.
Thank you, Jay. Joe?
Well, thank you, Jay. I mean, I always expected him to have the full broad brush overview. And certainly it's as Steve pointed out, it's a bittersweet moment to say farewell to a board which I served for 10 years, and part of the experiment I participated in Jay's language, and also cherished, by participating in the board. So my entry to the board was in 2012. It was quite unplanned. One Saturday morning, then the lead scientist, Peter Goodwin, called me and broached the idea that would you like to serve on the board, or would you like to apply to serve on the board of Delta Sweat, the Independent Science Board. So Peter and I went long ways back, and we shared the same laboratory space at W.M. Keck Laboratory of Hydraulics and Water Resources at Caltech. And I met him later, about a decade later, at the NSF Committee on Cyber Infrastructure. So we had all these different type of backgrounds. And then another decade later, I met him at LCA, Louisiana Coastal Area Science Board. Actually, Peter took the helm of the board later, after Don Bosch left, and Steve Brandt was a member. And Steve was an advocate for fish then, as he is now. And so I still remember, they had a lot of anecdotes about Steve, which I'm not going to mention. But however, I was a little bit uncomfortable in applying for the position, and it might be useful for some people. The reason I was a little bit uncomfortable is that I did not have much Delta science experience, or I was not up to par with the Delta science problems. I lived in Arizona for a while and now in Indiana. And so Delta science was not on my horizons at that time. So I was uncomfortable. And also here, and as many of you are in universities, I had a large research group, about 15 people of different types, which I had to find money to sustain. So you just run around, even still I do that. So that was a major concern. However, Peter kind of assured me that I will be able to do contributions to ISB if I keep my scientific background applied to this correctly, since I have some big science experience, and you need a quick learning. Probably Peter thought that I can do that. And also, one of the things he also stressed, that working collaboratively or cordially with respect to your colleagues in the board, policymakers, respect the policymakers, as well as the stakeholders. So all those things he was laying out very carefully, I still remember. And one thing he forgot to mention, although he mentioned that there's a pending EIR-EIS review, he conveniently forgot to mention that it's 10,000 pages long at that time. It was just coming in as I came in. So after some vacillations, I decided to apply, and it was one of the best decisions, I should say, in my professional life. At the time, the board was kind of going through a transformation. It was kind of emphasizing on science, the modeling, the engineering aspect, the engineering science aspect was coming in, and observations, data sciences, cyber infrastructure, and that was a big draw because they were getting members. And the international reputation of board members were very appealing. Some of them I didn't know. But had I known that Jay Lunt and Steve Brandt would be joining soon after I joined, I would have jumped at the opportunity at that time. But anyway, things happened for good. And the experience with ISB was really most enriching than I expected. The learning curve was quite steep, and the board members were quite tolerant with my naive questions sometimes. With a wink and a nod, they kind of answered my questions quite nicely. And at that time, we had two out of West Coast members, that was Liz Canuel and myself. But Liz had experience about the Delta science because she has worked there before. So that made me the only person coming without too much knowledge about Delta. But however, as soon as I got in, I was basking in this fish and flow review. We started, Jay and Steve joined, of course, as soon as he came. Then there's a water quality review going on. Adaptive management was going on. So that basically helped me to get acquainted with the problems and the issues of Delta quite quickly, I would say. Somewhat I was satisfied. I was quite apprehensive of myself, but I was a little bit satisfied that I could do some of the chapters for the EIR, because I carried some academic experience with noise, air pollution, fluid mechanics, greenhouse gases, wildfires, all these aspects I have published. So as soon as I came, I could make some immediate contributions to EIR. So I was somewhat pleased that I accepted the position. It was ironic that I'm leaving now, but we are still working on EIR, EIS after 10 years. So that shows that the politics do matter and somewhat driving science, as Jay mentioned. The field trips I really enjoyed, and they were very valuable to orient myself to the Delta science and Delta broad overview of Delta science, and familiarize with the hardware, the operations, stakeholders. And when we went for those field trips, we had conversations with the locals. That was very, very useful. They gave us a different perspective and their frustrations. And I hope that these field trips will continue in the years to come, as well as we have some meetings, board meetings outside Sacramento, so that the locals can participate more readily than coming to Sacramento. I also learned quite a bit from my colleagues, then the science program staff and public, as I mentioned. Science program staff was really, really helpful. And the learning came during more informal interactions rather than during board, but we had presentations of certain issues, but the informal interactions were very much appreciated for me to learn. I also missed the board dinners we had. It was the time to get organically connect with the board members and learn about them and their expertise, and also to recharge ourselves for the following day meeting. It was long meetings we had at that time. So when I started doing the Delta Science Board activities, this concept of one Delta, one science, it always was back of my mind. So I try to look at the issues in a broad perspective, like more holistic perspective, rather than attempt to patchwork on most of these individual modes of inquiries. So I try to look at in a broad perspective, but that really was helped by the diversity of the board, as Jay mentioned, the diversity of science of the board. And they brought in different perspectives and encyclopedic knowledge, some of the members, and the writing and editing skills, some of them, too many people to mention here, and the collegiality, the respect for each other's work and opinions. And so those were all positive attributes we had. And I really thank to board members, the board chairs, and Steve just outgoing. I don't have time to mention all of them, but really appreciate the way you handle and you included people and also included the opinions of people. That's quite important, as Steve was talking about that a few minutes ago. Get everybody's opinion in a correct representative manner. So I had to give key kudos to the Delta Science Program and lead scientists for selecting a very in-depth group of people and harmonious group as board members. So I had great pleasure of serving them for these resourceful lead scientists. So during my time, Peter Goodwin, Cliff Dahm came, John Calloway, and Laura Lawson, our current. They were really superb Delta navigators, I would say. And also they kind of carefully threaded and melded the science, government, agency, societal aspects. And I hope that their independence will continue, as Jay mentioned. That is very important for an independent science board. Sometimes it was hard to work in the midst of Adversity, we had several of them. And at that time, our support came from Delta Stewardship Council. So I thank the council at this time for their unflinching support to the Independent Science Board. And the lead scientists, board chairs, we really appreciate their help and their guidance. And my special thank goes to Sea Grant Fellows. And most recently, the postdoctoral fellows we have, they were really contributing and reduce our workload and also brought in different perspectives. And today's presentation by our postdoctoral fellows, it really is a testimony how we have managed to attract superb postdoctoral fellows. I really hope that that program will continue so that we can have many more of them. As for me, the impact of the board pervaded, included to my home institutions also. It was kind of on the side. So I invited several board members to speak in person at Notre Dame. So they came down here. Unfortunately, COVID took over, so I couldn't continue the program, but hopefully in the future. And so they came here and talked to our undergraduates, graduate students about big science and big science issues and how the multidisciplinary collaboration. In fact, we had 2 lead scientists here in person for colloquia at Notre Dame. And it was inspiring to see that how our students were reacting to their presence. And I hope that was something for our own institution, how the Delta Science Board really has contributed to the benefit of our own institutions. Also, I had the pleasure of meeting a few our own alumni who are contributing to Delta Science. And we don't have that big cohort like Jay has, but a few people I would like to mention. I met Delta Water Master Michael George is one of our alumni, and then Lisa Lucas, Steve Ellis now in the Delta Science program. All these people are Notre Dame alums, and they have the face of our institution. Then finally, I have to thank the DSP staff. Now, particularly, I want to mention Edmund Yu. I kind of avoided mentioning people's names. Edmund Yu, I was relying on him to a fault. And like Jay said, Edmund will sort out things. And I hope he will continue to sort out things and continue his services. And also there are many, many people I could not thank, but maybe the face of it is Lauren Hastings of the famous Hastings reports Jay was talking about. And of her caliber, all the staff members of her caliber, they have been of great help to the board, and I hope their services will continue. And their work is beyond the call of duty, I would say. And I would remiss if I don't thank the people of Delta, the people of the state of California, giving me the opportunity to serve in the board, and also people of Delta, and also the stakeholders. And you know how many people are coming and giving their testimonies in the science board meetings, and also they meet us outside and give their opinions. This is a very good, healthy conversation, and I hope that will continue. And so with that, I will stop talking about, and I would like to say what I wrote for the Delta Science Program Communication Office. To say the least, serving on the Delta Independent Science Board was a profoundly rewarding experience. It was a rare opportunity to collaborate with a multidisciplinary group of world-class scientists to help address problems of crucial societal impact. The superb support provided by Delta Science Program staff cannot be overstated. So thank you all, and it was certainly a pleasure to be with you guys, and hope our paths will cross again.
Thank you guys for very, very thoughtful comments about your experiences on the board. Any board members have anything they'd like to contribute? Yes, Tanya.
Just want to say thank you to you both. You've been just a tremendous source of wisdom. I've been on the board for only 2 years, and I have just really appreciated your leadership on the board, your insights, and just giving us great examples for how we can continue to work in a collegial, open, transparent, and thoughtful way moving forward. So thank you for your time and giving us good guidance. We'll miss you.
Okay, Tom?
I just wanted to say a few words from the perspective of someone. When I joined the board 5 years ago, it was already I'll call it a fully functioning board. They had been together for a while. And so I felt like I was parachuting into outer space watching Jay and Joe. But I want to say that I've learned some things from you. Jay, I think from you, I learned don't violate the law, but you can violate the rules. And I mean that in a very positive way, because Jay was a very good outside the box thinker, as you've learned. And during my whole time on the board, I've been impressed by the way conversations can make 90-degree turns after Jay's comments. And Joe, I've really enjoyed getting to know you. And I think the thing that probably impressed me the most was when we had the last big rotation on the board, we had the monitoring enterprise review sort of hanging out there, and the way you stepped forward to finish that really, I appreciated that. Jay and I were tied up with the water supply reliability review and really couldn't contribute a lot to that at that point in time. And the way you took that on, I think really speaks well of how the board functions. We step in for each other. So I want to thank both of you guys and say I really have enjoyed working with you. Look forward to some 3-minute comments.
Okay, Virginia Madueno, Council Chair. You're on mute.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. On behalf of the Delta Stewardship Council and all of my peers, I just want to again commend both you, Dr. J, I'm going to call you Dr. J, and Dr. Joe, for your leadership, for your dedication, and for your tenacity. And, you know, to hear your comments, both of you, it really is a reflection of what this body embodies, if you will. To hear your thoughts, to hear your wisdom, and to see again, and I'm not sure, I think it was you, Jay, who mentioned that you are not a political body, right? You are scientists that are trying truly to create and to help solve problems and to troubleshoot, if you will. And as a layperson, I just want to say the Independent Science Board really is an essential part of what we look for in terms of our role as members of the Delta Stewardship Council. It is your wisdom, it is your expertise, it is your independence that we rely so heavily on. And so again, I just want to commend the two of you. And although I'm probably the newest kid on the block with the Delta Stewardship Council and not having a background, to Joe's comments, it really is a remarkable, it's a remarkable body, if you will, that we get to represent. And again, not getting too political, it is your independent science that we are going to be very much acutely paying attention to. As I travel throughout the Delta and I get to meet people that live there, that work there, that depend, if you will, on their fishing there, it reminds me again how important it is for me to share with them that I get to work with an independent science board and with the lead scientist, Dr. Larson, that this is what we get to work with. This is who we get to work with to, again, help to navigate, again, our decision-making on this important body. And I will also just I think both of you mentioned, and more you, Jay, than Joe, in terms of some of the unfortunate situations that you encountered, having served on the Independent Science Board. And I came in at the very tail end. And I will just say that, unfortunately, sometimes legislation has some unintended consequences, as we learned, unfortunately. And I think no question that we all regret what happened, but we so look forward to moving forward, if you will, and continuing to work with all of you that are going to remain. We will miss you, Dr. J. We will miss you, Dr. Joe. But you leave a very capable board, and I so look forward to working with the rest of you, and look forward to the new incoming scientists that are going to come help finish this puzzle. Or actually, it's a puzzle that's never going to be finished. So continuing on in building on this puzzle. And again, just want to say thank you to both of you and applaud you both.
Thank you.
Thank you, Virginia. Laura Larson, Delta Lead Scientist.
Thank you, Steve. And first of all, I just wanted to say I really appreciated the two sets of reflections that Dr. Lund and Dr. Fernando provided us with today. And also the discussion about the importance of partnership between the Delta Science Program and the Delta Independent Science Board. If there's one regret that I have here, it's that I came into this position in the middle of a pandemic, and until very recently had only really had the opportunity to interact with this board virtually. I'm glad that things are changing. I'm glad that we are going back to in-person meetings and have had an opportunity to have some really fantastic field trips in the Delta together. And I look forward to continuing to grow this partnership with the ISB. But Jay and Joe, I regret that I haven't had more time to spend with both of you in person. That said, even in the virtual setting, I have learned a tremendous amount from both of you. Jay, I really appreciate the depth of local knowledge that you bring to this board, and the way in which you've served as a teacher and mentor for all of us. I think that really has shown through on the field trips that we've been on. And you know, your leadership in the field and bringing local knowledge to this board is frankly inspiring. I know that you've inspired me to put together some new field trips for my classes when I go back to the academic world fully. Joe, I really appreciate the warmth and the collegiality that you've shown, particularly, and your positive attitude, particularly in the face of very difficult circumstances. I appreciate you really stepping up and exhibiting leadership in the monitoring enterprise review, as Tom mentioned a little bit earlier. One thing that I'd like to say to the general public here is that something that is very clear in your participation on this board is your extreme dedication to public service. And, you know, I think this is an important thing to flag for the general public, because the things that you are doing on this board are things that you are not going to really receive much recognition for in your career. It's not necessarily advancing your academic publications or accolades that come through the academy. But that said, what you're doing, it's a huge investment of time. And as we saw from Lauren Hastings' report, it's something that really has an impact on how we steward this place, this Delta, and ensure that it maintains a reliable water supply for future generations and protects ecosystems while maintaining a sense of place. That's a tall order. And you all have shown nothing but an extremely high level of dedication beyond that which you are compensated for in this endeavor. And so that's something that I think is under-recognized and underappreciated. And I really wanted to thank you for that dedication to public service. And then finally, I think what I'll end on is just highlighting that your service on this board is a form of academic government partnership. I think Jay mentioned that this is an experiment in governance. And I think part of the success story here, I recognize fully that we do have ground to cover in fully realizing our mission. But I think that the success story here is that academic government partnerships open up new perspectives, and I think are synergistic in really advancing the mission and impact of both types of contributions. For example, you all have been very effective at highlighting where government science might not be well aligned with the state of the science, or where there might be blind spots in terms of what agencies are doing with respect to their ability to steward a sustainable ecosystem far into the future. In return, I think that what the government has brought to your work is a recognition of the pressures that government scientists operate under, the pressures that agencies operate under, the need to do things in short amounts of time. And I've been really impressed at the way in which you might have shifted out of the typical academic box to recognize those pressures, recognize those constraints, and be willing and just be very sensitive to them, and be willing to work within them. I think you all have just demonstrated a lot of insight, foresight, astuteness on how to make science effective in an environment that is highly political and that is highly pressured. So thank you for all that you've taught us. Thank you for your service. I expect that we will stay in touch. I hope that you will continue to tune in to board meetings and drop us a line whenever we're going astray. And thank you, and enjoy your return back to academia.
Thank you.
Thanks, Laurel. Obe?
I'll make it very short. I want to thank you, these two gentlemen I have known for some time. Jay, I have known for years as one of the best people probably in the country who knows about the systems approach to water resources, problems or issues, particularly in California. When he encouraged me to apply some time back, I thought he would serve with me. I had no idea he was going to leave me here. Just joking, but I'm hoping you would take my calls when I have some questions for you. And Joe, I have known him when he was a grad student at Johns Hopkins, and I thought he would be in a lab doing experiments, and I think he has contributed a lot to this process. And I also will call him when I have some questions. So thank you both for your excellent service.
Call anytime, Obe.
Any other comments? Okay, thanks again, Joe and Jay. You know you will be missed. You've heard it from all of us, and we know we're going to bump into each other again. I know Jay's going to be editing anything I write. He's agreed to do that. Joe, I know, has invited me to Notre Dame, so I think hopefully I will be working with them, and I know that on behalf of the board, you certainly are going to be missed. So good luck, and thanks again for your service. Any public comments on this item, Edmund?
Yes, we have one from Deirdre Desjardins. Deirdre, you have the ability to unmute your microphone. Thank you.
Yeah, Deirdre Desjardins with California Water Research. And I just wanted to thank Jay and Joe and also Steve for what I learned from them personally. I wanted to say that seeing Steve and Jay's leadership last year when the Delta Independent Science Board defunded was really transformative for me. I was profoundly influenced by their humility and patience, and also by the quiet strength of Joe Fernando and the rest of the Delta Independent Science Board. My research training was in theoretical physics. I did graduate research in nonlinear dynamics and complex systems theory at Los Alamos National Lab and the Santa Fe Institute for Complex Systems. I will tell you that theoretical physicists are not humble, but I found Steve and Jay's humble leadership during a really difficult year to be profoundly effective and inspiring. And I also wanted to say that the Delta stakeholders I work with and myself remain profoundly grateful to Jay for his work on the water supply reliability review and Joe for his work on the monitoring enterprise review during the time the board was defunded. This was exceptional professional service, and it really helped hold the board together and keep it moving forward at a time when it was in danger of falling apart. And we'll all be forever grateful for that. And finally, I wanted to say that I'm by nature a very serious person, but I did learn the value of humor from Jay and Steve last year. It seemed like the more dire things got, the more jokes they cracked. And I realized that also helped greatly to cheer everybody up and keep the board going. And these are just wonderful lessons. And I wanted to thank all of you for that. And I will miss Jay and Joe greatly, but I think the board is in a much stronger position, and hope to keep attending these meetings. So thank you.
Okay, thanks, Deidre. Any other public comments, Edmund?
No additional public comments.
Okay, move on to item number 6, which is the preparation for upcoming meetings. I'll only talk about our next meeting, which is another scheduled face-to-face meeting from November 2nd through the 4th. We're going to have some time for staff briefings and spend the lion's share of the work talking about the latest version of our EIR review. We will have 2 new members. Our 2 new board members will be joining us at that meeting. We're probably going to have a presentation on restoration synthesis by Dylan Chappell from the science program. He's recently, I think, completing a manuscript, a review manuscript on that topic. And then we'll reconvene our Delta lead scientists and Delta Stewardship Council reports as well as part of that. On November 4th, we're planning a half-day field trip. Right now it's scheduled on the YOLO Bypass Tour, looking at Fremont and Wallace Weirs. Be part of that tour. I think it's scheduled, Edmund sent to you the time it would end roughly around 2, I believe. Don't quote me on that, so you can schedule your travel for that. And then on our next meeting is a teleconference meeting on December 8th. And the primary topic on that agenda will be to vote on acceptance of our EIR review. So that's any public comment on that item, Edmund?
No public comments.
Okay, our next topic is the review of items for follow-up, Edmund?
Yes. So here are the staff follow-up items. There is a QEM technical workshop at the end of the month on water supply reliability estimation, which would feature the Delta ISB review on this topic. And staff are going to check to see if the QEM workshop on water supply reliability estimation is being recorded, and we'll provide that information once we have it. Today, Kristine and Lillian gave a great presentation on mitigation, Staff will timestamp the recording to that presentation and make sure those ISB members who could not attend will watch that presentation. Based on feedback today, the postdocs will consider whether to move forward with a paper on mitigation focused on California, which may help inform future ISB review topics. For the EIR review, individual Delta ISB members should submit their individual comments to inform the main review by the end of business tomorrow. So please submit those to staff. The current target is to release a public draft for both the full board to review and also for the public to provide comment on will be on October 24th and December 1st. So please block that off on your calendar, and we'll also provide a more detailed schedule after this meeting. As part of the EIR discussion today, there was a question of how were alternatives narrowed down. Tanya provided an appendix reference for Joe where this information is potentially in, and as his potential final assignment, Joe will see if that is adequate or if further clarification is needed from DWR. And lastly, I will update our Delta ISB reflections document with Joe and Jay's reflections from today on their 10-year service. So they are memorialized and can be used for recruitment of new Delta ISB members in the future. On that note, this concludes my final items for follow-up for Jay and Joe, and I would like to thank them for their 10-year service, and it has been a huge honor working with both of you for about half a decade. Any questions?
Thank you so much, Edmund, for everything.
Again, mine too.
Okay, thanks for that, Edmund. The final thing on the agenda is any public comments for items that are not on the agenda?
There are none.
Okay,
Actually, hold on, sorry. There's one from Deirdre Desjardins. Deirdre, you have the...
Sorry, Edmund, I raised my hand really quickly. Deirdre Desjardins with California Water Research. I just wanted to, I'll send this to the board. I just wanted to call your attention to some high resolution climate modeling that I recently ran across. Unlike the global climate models, it found decreases in precipitation were larger across the highest terrain of the Sierra Nevada. And this meant that they found that extreme integrated vapor transport events generally produce precipitation increases across most of the western US, particularly across the northern Sierra Nevada. But in contrast, moderate integrated vapor transport events had large decreases in the Sierras. And so the net result of this is that there's a net decrease in annual precipitation, and this just isn't resolved by the current generation of global climate models, such as ones used in the Delta Tunnel EIR, because you need higher resolution to resolve the terrain in California. So I'll send this to you, but it's got some fairly profound implications because it projects a kind of decreases in annual precipitation that we're currently seeing. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Deirdre, and thanks everyone for a great meeting, and have a good weekend. Meeting's officially adjourned.